Pueden
For
también
Spanish-speaking participants, you can select the interpretation button into the other languages. Okay, welcome. Welcome to this seminar workshop evaluation during the pandemic. This is part of a series of encounters or meetings that we have arranged together with the World Bank and the dialogue around the effects of the crisis of the pandemic on the educational system and recovery strategies. We are really pleased to have you all here. I'm going to ask Emanuela Di Giopello from the World Bank to give us her welcoming remarks. Thank you very much, Ariel. I don't know if you can hear me. We can hear you quite well. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And as Ariel just mentioned, this is a warm welcome into this webinar on the diagnosis of learning in Latin America. As Ariel just mentioned, this webinar is part of a series of events which will address topics related to the return to school and the learning process, which has been arranged by the Dialogue and the World Bank. On my part, just a couple of context words. I think that we are absolutely aware of the severity of the crisis that is affecting the educational sector in Latin America. The figures that we're estimating at this time, they're indicating that more than 70% of our adolescents could be below the minimum levels of performance in the reading process. And the actual data that we've seen on the learning loss, they're confirming this information. They're confirming that this is the worst situation, that loss of learning will the figures will be really high. So within this context, we have all noticed that we do not have any time to waste. We need to start right away to recover this lost learning. And a fundamental stage in the current context where we're reopening schools and where the academic year is beginning in many schools is to start by measuring, diagnosing where are our kids, what's their learning level. How are they going to school after these closures? Now, the thing is that there are many questions asked in terms of the type of diagnosis and that the type of assessment to how can we design this diagnosis? How can we implement it? So hopefully in this context, the report that will be presented today and the discussion that we will have after the report could actually clarify some of the questions and identify best practices that can actually support the different countries to keep on advancing. So I'm going to stand here because I do want to give you the essence of this event. I want to welcome you all on the part of the World Bank and to express my gratitude for your presence, hoy. And I'll pass the floor to Ariel to give us some more details in terms of how the session will be arranged today. Thank you, Manuela. And the main purpose of the encounter today is to share with you a report that we just published it today around the evaluation or assessment in the pandemic and the role of the diagnosis, the pre-learning diagnosis for the recovery efforts. We're going to hear from two of the authors of this report, Ana Herrero Tejada and Marina Lopez Javi. They are our colleagues from the Inter-American Dialogue, and they will give us a very short presentation. Then we will be sharing in the chat the page where you can download the report, and then we will have a space for debate, which will be led by one of the authors of the report, Felipe Arias. Then we will have a space to respond to questions from our audience. So during the event, you may use the Q&A button or icon for you to send or for you to share your ideas and any questions that you may have for the report authors or for the panelists. And we will do as much as we can to respond them in writing or to respond them in the time that we have allotted for that purpose. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be available, and the video will be available in our webpage right after we end the sessions. Without any further ado, I would like to invite Ana and Marina so that you can do your presentation. Thank you, Ariel. Excellent. I think you can already see my presentation. Thank you all for being here today. So very briefly, as Ariel mentioned, we hope we can present the findings of the study that would lead between both the dialogue and the World Bank in relation to the pandemic, and how can we use the progress that has taken place within the framework. So first of all, I want to explain which were the questions that led our study, our investigation. We have 4 main questions, and we're going to address them as they were produced in the study. First of all, we wanted to know what happened in terms of the pandemic with the standardized devices of monitoring and evaluation at a national, regional, and international level, and what happened with the education assessment devices. Then we wanted to find out what are the changes and innovations that have taken place during the pandemic, and what will be the projection for the upcoming editions. And then finally, the question around what is the role of both types of devices in the diagnosis process of losses and gaps in the learning process, thinking of a recovery scenario and resiliency after the pandemic. So Marina is going to present the findings on the different standardized devices at a national, regional, and international level, and then I will explain the different education cases during the pandemic. Move on. Thank you, Ana. Welcome. So we're going to start by presenting. This is the description, and then we will do an analytical approach in terms of the standardized assessments, they being understood as the learning that are measuring the academic educational achievements in the different educational systems. We did a differentiation among the assessments aimed at monitoring purposes of those assessments for certification purposes, which we'll be presenting later on. And these assessments were really applicable in the primary and secondary level, and they give access to higher superior levels. And we will begin by mentioning the national assessments, and then we will move into the regional, and then we will go to the international assessments in this session. After doing this, this is the characterization of this, or this is the map of the national evaluations during the 2 years of pandemic, 2020, 2021. 2020 was a year where we had the outbreak, the epidemiology crisis, and then the closure of the schools in most of the educational systems in the region. And the consequence of these had to do with the national assessments at a national level in 2020 of the total devices that used in the study, which were 22 corresponded or were implemented in that year, and only 7 of those were applied effectively in 2021, unlike 2020, in a year where there was a progressive reopening of schools, we see that of the 24 national devices that were assessed for monitoring and for certification purposes, 63% of those were applied effectively. You can see the different types of educational systems, and in green you can see those that where they applied all the different assessments which were applied on that year. In yellow, those that implemented at least one, and in red, those that didn't implement any of the evaluations or assessments that had to be done. Then moving on to the regional level, we can see at the lab of UNESCO, they have monitoring assessments of those exams for certification purpose, admission and selection. As you can see on the table in 2020 and in 2021, they were not applied because they were implemented in 2019. But of the exams that you were applying on a yearly basis, they were sustained in 2020 and in 2021 with a small flexibilization or customization in terms of date of application, or given the fact that different systems could decide to participate in some and not in others. Now, moving on to the international evaluations during the pandemic, the only two that were applied in 22 and which were implemented of the two devices, but among those that were done, PISA was not applied in 2021. It was postponed for 2022, despite the fact that a pilot PISA test was implemented, and then the device was effectively applied last year. So what are some of the trends that we have observed based on the information provided by official sources and also by discussing with the key actors? In terms of the national devices, one trend that we found was of the total devices that were applied effectively in 2020 and in 2021. In 2022, we gave priority to those aimed at certification and admission or selection, those having a direct impact in the educational path of the different students. As you can see in the figures in 2020, of the total national assessments applied, 14% represented those for monitoring purposes, and 86% those aimed at certification, admission, and selection. A percentage that is inverted in 2021 slightly, but the trend is to recover the assessments for monitoring purposes that took place last year, and they represented 53% of those actually applied. A second trend has to do with the fact that out of the total national devices that were implemented in 2020 and in 2021, the only aspects or characteristics that represented changes or modifications are related to the format of the application of the test, which tends to be more and more digital or mixed, when in the past it was mostly paper-based. And supplementary information apart from the test and the different context scenarios or supplementary scenarios, we included questions related to how was the teaching or the learning process during the pandemic. And we also strengthened the questions related to social-emotional skills of students. This is a trend that, although was already present in some of the national devices beforehand, was reinforced to learn what was the situation with these aspects during the pandemic. So in terms of the modality of application in person, which remained the same in most of the cases to the situation prior to the pandemic. So the third trend in the national assessment has to do with those devices that were not applied in 2020 or in 2021. And this is attributed to health reasons, but some of them mention the technical reasons, difficulty to ensure validity and reliability of the instrument in the conditions of application due to the pandemic. Now, moving on to the international assessment trends, we must mention that the planning and of international evaluation was relatively stable, but we did find two trends. First of all, the use of technology, not only to innovate in terms of how to assess, but also to strengthen the correction instruments of these evaluations. You will find some examples in the presentation, and in the report, but an adaptational design that is also interactive, and there will be more sophisticated mechanisms to correct in team spheres and in teams and PISA. And a second trend that is related to the incorporation of new assessment objects as this was information that was already planned prior to the pandemic and which remains stable. In the case of PISA, creative thinking will be assessed, and teams and pearls, the citizen, digital citizenship, and then practices which are more related to the latest trends or more popular movements, authoritarian governments, and in Codex of C4, the sustainable development goal related to climate change and environmental protections. And teams will also assess resolution of problems or troubleshooting. What are the projections of assessments in relation to the national evaluations as we mentioned in the trends, as the schools open and as they recover, will go back to school, they are foreseeing the implementation of at least one or all the national evaluations for this year as planned prior to the pandemic. In terms of the regional and international evaluations, ERCE is currently developing a qualitative study on the results of the latest edition in 2019. The examinations in the Caribbean will remain without further modifications, and at an international level, the following editions will begin this year with PISA and with, next year with ICES and teams, and Pearls in 2026. Thank you, Marina. Now we're going to talk about the education assessments that have taken place during the pandemic. They gained relevance in the last decade, becoming a critical path of the educational system in the countries in the region, and especially in the recovery process to respond to the learning gaps due to the pandemic, which emphasizes the relevance of these education processes, as Marina mentioned, with the delays in the application of multiple national devices or tools. These evaluations will have a role that is more significant compared to other years. Within this category of education, this includes evaluations at a central level, and then distributed in the classroom as diagnosis exercises, which are part of more extensive programs in the pedagogical in settings. If we move on to the following slide. Perfect. Apart from the geographical diversity, the different initiatives that we have selected to list in this report, they're mostly coming from a diversity of governments, four from governments and three from the civil society, and they are closely related to government and non-government entities. Four of the initiatives were implemented for the first time in the academy, two as response to this, and several of the cases they explain the innovative use of digital platforms such as the IQ diagnostic and the platform in Brazil. And there are some reports on recovery, such as the tutorials in Carvajal and the tutorials of NIA, and the education for teachers to improve diagnosis methodologies like the CREATE project. We can move on to the following slide. To analyze and compare these cases, we have defined four key axes: the domain of the assessment or the content approach if the test is aligned with the plans of the curriculum, or they're focused on true parts with the recovery and the different programs of specific or guidance which have to do with the outcomes of the test, the role of the teacher and its implementation and use, and then finally the funding that we do require. So the first axis that we're mentioning, which has to do with the domain of the evaluation, we can see that the approach that the different evaluations should have is has created tension in the latest year, especially in reference to the different educational assessments and the diagnosis. In general terms, we have two priority approaches in the cases studied. One of them is the test with the curriculum approach on expected learning or predetermined learning, and the other one is on tests with focus on basic learning or fundamental learning. This debate or this tension has gained relevance in the crisis of the pandemic, where this will require a very significant exercise, and many times it will be independent or will be misaligned with other approaches. With respect to the analytical they were implemented from the national governments. They tend to measure achievements in terms of the objectives and the curriculum, which are predetermined. While during the pandemic, we saw a trend of the civil society towards initiatives developed to emphasize their focus on fundamental learning with the aim, in order to address the most evident gaps. We can see two examples in this case. This is a very active component of the assessment as a primordial part. We have applied the MIA test to more than 300,000 kids together with the state governments, and also with programs, remedial programs or recovery programs, which are in line with the different training sessions for teachers. And then in Chile, although the new tests of the DIA Plus, dialect and DIA Matter, focusing on competence, basic skills, reading and mathematics, they're strongly aligned to the curriculum learning or expected of first and second graders. The guiding routes or aligned to the results are more general. They're integrated in the same test. Likewise, we also, this is a scale, it covered 64,000 boys and girls. At the same time, in certain contexts, in the one in Chile, the gaps of access and learning that we noticed in the pandemic, they led to discussions on the adaptation of national curriculum. And at the end of although the devices can actually support the work of teachers to map the progress of students against the pedagogical objectives in the crisis situation, in the opening situation, as mentioned in the last question, it will be very important to consider the role of the educational assessments focused on actual learning. Next. Now, in terms of the recovery of learning, the value of the different assessment tools depends on the good alignment to the recovery experts. Now, with respect to the cases analyzed in general terms, we normally see that government initiatives or those of a greater reach focus on supporting a quick diagnosis in line with only the guidance, the pre-designed or standardized learning for both teachers and students. The efforts of lower scale, many of them were coming from the civil society. In general terms, they built their assessment exercises on a strategy that was already in place. So the programs, the remedial programs, are the framework where we are developing this type of objectives of the assessment. As you can see, and in the example of the Fundación Carvajal, they implemented a program, a tutorial program in Colombia, and they do 24 of them on 12 weeks. This is a significant program, and it is based on the application, and the initial application of EGRA and ECMAR in order to level the different students having more, which are more lagged. Then in the pandemic, the implementation was via WhatsApp, and they emphasized the need to provide direct support with the different students based on the results of the test. Then on the other hand, as in the case of SEA, but in the case of the new platform of CAET or NEC, these are platforms are automated, and they have an integrated system with personalized routes, and which are coming up from the automated analysis of the outcomes of the different tests. Or in this platform in SEA, for example, the teacher can customize the content of the test, and the application, they're normally done digitally, even during the pandemic. In terms of the initiatives, which aim at creating a quick diagnosis, the creation of a customized program aligned to the instruments is, of course, less viable. The cost of programs of complex recovery, like EGRA or tutorials, or the tutorials of me as well. This implies a higher cost compared to the creation of different routes at a financial or capacity level. We're in Axis 2. However, within the reopening framework, the recovery approach is suggesting non-governmental initiatives, those that are analyzed in the report, they can actually contribute to possible models for the scale implementation. It is possible to develop a remedial process that is more aligned based on the national curriculum, if this is the priority of the educational approaches, and with relevant objectives specific to the results of the test. Now let's move on to the third axis. Thank you. Throughout the crisis, the role of the teacher has been more fundamental in the efforts of learning, measurement, and recovery. Teachers are the ones that are the main parties that apply these instruments, and they're priority users of the data that may result in this case. In the cases analyzed, teachers are involved in aspects related to the application, the design, correction, analysis, and of course, the use of these tests and the initiatives. Normally, teachers have been key authors or actors in the deployment of these strategies, even in the correction or analysis and the documentation of results in the different platforms. In the evaluations, this is a similar model to the EduORI, or the new diagnostics evidence or test in Brazil. They do it from an online repository. They apply, they correct, and they upload the data to the online platform, apart from using the results of this process to report their own actions. At the same time, depending on the initiative, teachers have had different levels of training, from seminars all the way to support capacities, direct support in the use on the application of the test.
So in this case, they've applied an extensive course of training in order to develop technical capacities for the application and use of training assessments in multi-grade schools and in technical units in the different districts of Granja Marca in Peru. Beyond the training, one strong challenge faced by all initiatives, especially in the context of the pandemics, the reopening. As we see in the final question, it's showing the background and the potential of these instruments and platforms in order to support their pedagogical initiatives. And here it's key considering the best ways to mark this test as an exercise of support in first instance, and in the recommendations we will reprise this subject. Then we go to the fourth axis. Most part of the region, most states didn't have the capacity to develop the efficiency and reach necessary to support teachers and students in remedial actions before the crisis and the reopening. So we've seen a proliferation of alliances and cooperation between the public and private sector and the civil society. In the analyzed cases, we see some cooperations that are within the framework of these slides. Firstly, we have that governments are training the technical capabilities for the civil society and the core sector in order to develop and apply diagnostic tests. And there are some other agreements in order to schools to have access to the system. And we also have the role of multilateral organization, which proves the replicability and the scalability of these initiatives. Two examples of cooperation and alliances are that on one hand, we have in Dominican Republic, the Education Ministry developed a diagnostic test applied in 2021, and at first, they used the platform of IQ in order to distribute this new test to more than 30,000 students. This was in language and mathematics in primary and secondary education. It was aligned to the national curriculum for the development by the ministry. On the other hand, we see the development of this great platform in Brazil, which was developed in cooperation with several institutions of the private sector, the research center, CAET, and there is a repository of diagnostic tests launched in 2021, and they want to become an important part of the Brazilian ecosystem aligned with the national curriculum. It's important to assess other areas besides this in which there are cooperation and alliances between the government and civil society or the government and private sector in order to keep working on this report. We indicated that by developing different approaches, or one way, it's developing more relevant approaches for the content of tests, focusing on real lessons learned and learning from the tools and instruments that have already been implemented in order to focus this sort of evaluations on learning, and cooperating with the development of recovery programs, which are well aligned, tutorships, and teachers training. Then in the report, we included a section that covers the different factors to consider for the implementation and replicability of each case beyond the individual effectiveness of each initiative. And it's important to consider the different factors that may ease or limit or deter its implementation according to the context and the educational goals in each country. The estimated cost of initiatives, it's just one of the factors that need to be considered, and they are determined by the characteristics of each model based on the analysis we've presented in the model and that we're presenting today. We've identified three key characteristics. The first one is if it is required for the application of this strategy, the hiring of technical personnel, it would be tutors or other personnel, or the training of volunteers and teachers. And there are other initiatives from the government in which governments or institutions applying this says have networks of teachers in their public systems, and the civil society, on the other hand, depend on the additional support of hired personnel. Also, the government initiatives may benefit from training models that we've seen have been required in projects of the civil society. A second factor is the application mean of these tests or evaluations. We've seen several automated platforms that required connectivity, direct connectivity with high quality. In order to be able to apply the test, we need to consider the coverage rate and the cost of development of these kind of platforms. And thirdly, the demand for pedagogic actions that are well aligned. And one of the main goals of the assessment training is the existence of actions that are well aligned, and in this context it's preferable to adopt an instrument with in general strategies and focus the efforts in financing and recovery programs for specific groups. So each one of these cases offered several options to consider in the models of characteristics. The characteristics are very different, and all these factors need to be considered when we are applying this in different contexts. I would like to give the floor to Marina. Thank you, Anna. And now we go to the third part of this presentation, which has to do with the recommendations of the study, and they come not only from the analysis performed by the teams, but also from meetings with key stakeholders, and after discussing and analyzing with experts in education from the region about these subjects. So these recommendations address or incorporate the education community and education leaders in different sectors, and there are four. The first one is a call to the ministries of education to prioritize the diagnostic evaluation that may or may not have training purposes in order to get to know and have updated and accurate information on the losses of learning in students after 2 years of pandemic. The benefits of these training diagnostics are the application and quick analysis that are accessible with timely information, but in order to do so, they need to be understandable and easy to use by teachers and school leaders. In each case, training and non-training or educational and non-educational, the diagnostic tools need to focus on what Anna mentioned. It's the learning and networks and what could have effectively be learned, at least in terms of the curriculum prioritization in the cases that they correspond to. The second recommendation or the second message we have has to do with the need of optimizing the information that it's relevant through national and regional devices in the past 2 years. On a regular basis, these studies have been implemented regularly and annually, but they allow comparability in time. But in case they don't, it's important to know this information that they provide because it can be valuable in order to think of the different efforts within a framework of recovery of learning. Then we go to the third and fourth recommendation, Anna. As we've mentioned in the presentation of the educational training, the diagnostic training, and need to empower the teacher with direct participation and relevant training in order to guarantee their applicability of this instrument and its use, and that we gain interest of teachers in the participation of these tests. Teachers need to be involved at different levels and from the beginning of the processes of implementation, and the experiences of training and accompaniment need to be designed, and they should be relevant for all the stakeholders in this process. And the last recommendation or final recommendation has to do with the role of the diagnostic evaluations in the long term. And we would like to emphasize that all these efforts of evaluation within the framework of recovery in the pandemic need to contribute to have a better evaluation system of learning in the long term. And in the report, we emphasized 3 characteristics. The first one is that the long-term system needs to be integrated. It means that each device needs to incorporate access and diagnostic goals, and it's a part of an interoperable system that makes sense altogether. Secondly, it's a understanding system, which a comprehensive system that includes not only the evaluation of learning, but of social and emotional competences. And thirdly, it needs to be sustainable in time, and sustainability in many cases has to do with the technical capacity, but the political will and in different institutions in order to make sure that this system may last in the long term and that all the progress can be incorporated in a sustainable manner. With this, we finish our presentation, and I would like to give the floor to Felipe, who will be moderating the next part of this meeting. Before giving the floor to Felipe, I wanted to congratulate Marina and Anna for your wonderful presentation, and I would like to invite everyone to download this report from the website. The website will be included in the chat, and I would like to remind you that you can ask your questions just by clicking on the Q&A section. I would like to invite Felipe, who is a researcher from the Superior Education in Social Anthropology, CSS, and he is co-responsible for the MIA project, which Anna referenced in her presentation. Felipe will be moderating this session, and I would like to present the panel. There are three wonderful speakers, and I would like to ask you, Felipe, and the other panelists to switch your cameras on. And Felipe, you've got the control of this panel. The floor is yours. Good morning. I would like to greet you from Jalapa, Veracruz. It's a warm day. We have a heat wave in our region. And truth be told, we are seeing that this subject of evaluation, and even more in this context, it's quite relevant in these educational discussions, because how do we know that there are losses that are not unpredictable, how to measure them and know what to do with them, and not measuring just because we are interested in getting to know a number, but it's actually to be able to recover these losses. And the idea of this panel is actually discussing some of the open questions that are there in this first document, and incorporating some other questions that are being asked by means of the Q&A section in the chat. So I would like to start with Mariela Celana. She's from Guatemala. She's the regional director for the network for Central America and the Caribbean, the LAC network. Be welcome, Mariela. And I wanted to ask you about two things. On one hand, how can we transform, how can we seize this extraordinary situation, which was the closing of schools and this need of thinking about other diagnostic and educational evaluations that allows us to conceive other kinds of alliances with governments and civil society, and how can we use this context and this new opportunity in order to strengthen intergovernmental and non-governmental alliances, and that support these efforts in order to get to know better what's happening in the classroom. So, Mariela, in a succinct manner, I would like to ask you to tell us about the barriers in order to strengthen these alliances between governmental and non-governmental entities in order to strengthen these evaluations, and to answer these questions that we have in terms of the effort of the learning crisis in our countries. So, Mariela, be welcome. Thank you, Felipe. I appreciate the invitation to comment on this event, and effectively, I think that I agree that the use of standardized evaluations and training evaluations based on curriculum cannot be in the exercise of measuring just because. The important thing is considering what to do with these inputs that this evaluation generates, and how we can link this with tools or curriculum instruments that actually allows us to establish or design and implementing interventions in order to effectively recover these learning. And what the study highlights, it's key. We need to seize the moment in the health crisis and the possibility of incorporating devices, technology, and hybrid modalities in the case of evaluations that in some cases were not written in hard copies evaluations, but the incorporation of devices in the cases in which this was conducted like that. And with regard to the barriers, you mentioned there is a potential for learning in terms of these alliances between the public and private sectors, but effectively, we need in the region, we need to work on the construction of trust between the government, the state, and the civil society organization, private organizations, because effectively these alliances will be more productive and will have a greater impact if there is a trust among different stakeholders, and this uh, trust will allow the development of capacities within the state and private institutions effectively in order to try to find different models that lead to effective interventions. And one of the benefits of these alliances is being able to seize this cooperation mutually. And I think we started having this exchange of knowledge and best practices that we need to keep identifying, that we need to systematize. And at the moment of having these interventions that we know and that worked, that were effective, we need to systematize them, identify their elements, and we need to analyze the possibility of escalating those that have worked or offer good results and are based on evidence. So I think we have an important momentum that may generate important benefits in order to innovate, to link the innovation with the curricular development. And I think in there, most educational systems in the region have that gap. And I think we can seize this momentum in order to effectively foster this linkage. Thank you very much, Mariela, for your insights. And this subject, we are facing different challenges simultaneously. Perhaps the most concerning one is the one coming from teachers, because now they're returning to schools. In some countries of the region, they started in March, at the beginning of March, and they are in this process of reopening schools physically. And in other countries of the region, after the fourth wave, they are returning to class, and there we see the need and how urgent it is to pay care to how this dynamic within the classroom happens, because in the classroom we see kids that kept learning, kids that advanced or progressed, some others that lost, some that are left behind. And teachers need to do something about that heterogeneity within the classroom. And it's not only on the side of teachers, schools also, because the different challenges on seeing or on determining how to take care of this heterogeneity, these differences within the classroom, and even more if we analyze this from the regional and national level, because we are glad having the President Sofia Leticia Morales, Secretary of Education in Nuevo León, Mexico, state. And I wanted to ask you, as part of this effort of reopening and cooperation, how can evaluation strategies be incorporated in order to support a teacher so that they can actually take care of this difference, this heterogeneity, with devices that are more at national level, and how at subnational level, state level, or municipality level, this can be applied. So I wanted to ask you about this. Thank you, and be welcome. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for this invitation. I wanted to agree with the recommendations of the report that were summarized by Anna and by Marina. And effectively, we in the government, the October the 4th is important because one way or the other, we is advocate the third wave, still fourth wave was not present, and we were able to be back at school in December, and this allowed us, and this relates to the first recommendation, prioritizing alliances with organizations from the civil society, diagnostic evaluations. And we were able to work with you in the case of MIA in the second and third primary grade. And that's important because we need to empower teachers, and thanks to the training work that you offered us in Veracruz and Ciesa, we were able to train supervisors, technical advisors and directors that trained teachers, and teachers themselves were the ones uploading data from the independent measurement of learning of kids from second and third and fourth grade. And in parallel, we had the evaluation of learning in the sixth grade of primary education in alliance with civil society, Siete Mares, with the goal of reprising these schools with lower score in 2018, and somehow or doing the comparison at this moment. And now we have data in order to share them with teachers in each school and supervision area. The evaluation of medium and high education in parallel was conducted with the support of Tecnológico de Monterrey, and we were able to evaluate more 75% of all students in mid and upper education. Depending on the public education, the Secretary of Education, we had this first step that it's shown the graph, which is the diagnosis, with the sole purpose of reinforcing the learning that are important and fundamental or skills from the 21st century, with the social or emotional education as the glue for them, and to use them in the project of this year, which is having an evaluation plan at state level in order to create in Nuevo León an evaluation system. So yesterday we had a meeting with Mejor Edu in order to articulate the test they will be conducting or applying, but not it's a representative sample that they will be taken from Nuevo León with our work of the state plan for evaluation that we intend to be set for the third grade primary and sixth grade of primary and third high school. So we're in the diagnostic phase and the evaluation of the students of the third grade secondary education, and we based on important learning, reading, understanding, basic calculation, reading, scientific learning, and social emotional learning. I don't know if you want to go to next slide. Lots of learning with the support of you on the independent measurement of learning. We were able to thanks to the empowering of teachers, we were able to get the results out of 239,579 kids that represent 83% of the population in the second, third, and fourth grades of primary education. Obviously, I won't discuss the results, but results were critical. And you can see on screen, that's not the goal of this presentation, but we need to optimize the information. And the other recommendation, how we are optimizing this so that the goes between a framework of recovery of learning and Ariel in sixth grade of primary. We ran the evaluation of these 325 schools, public schools in the most vulnerable schools, which represent only 28% of the primary enrollment, but that they represent the crisis in terms of learning and what we need to reinforce. Now, if we analyze the other one, this is the most important part, because in this evaluation in sixth degree, we have reactives of fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, and we linked this to the curriculum structure in order to provide tools to teachers in terms of what needed to be reinforced, such as learning gaps in Spanish and mathematics. And next slide, please. Here, this is what each director receives. It's information about each student and supervisors. And we today at noon we have a meeting with the director. At midday we have a meeting with the directors of these schools in order to let them know how to receive and use this information for the improvement of learning. In the case of mid and upper education, we started in October. In December, we already have data, but this data was used in order to report to each director of their system and institution. We reported the situation in terms of the learning that were essential, and these are the results that we found in first, second, and third grade in communications, mathematics, and science. But this information, which has been included for each institution, we use this for improvement strategies, and they had this information to work in mathematics, Spanish, and science. I think I'll stop here. There is a lot more of information to share, but I need to respect time. Thank you very much. Thank you. And in fact, this is a very good example of how we can articulate different evaluation strategies in the classroom with evaluations at a greater scale, and how we can use this information, because that's the question we all ask ourselves. Once we generate these processes of evaluation, what can we do with that? How can we articulate that in order to improve? And on this specific case and the uses of evaluations, we would like to see the presence of Santiago Cueto from Peru, Director of Integrade. He is an authority in these subjects in the region, and I wanted to thank his presence, but also ask Santiago, what are the conditions that may facilitate the active use of the information that it's gathered at this level, not only at classroom, but at public policies, because here we see a case, and how can we transform this and use this for the benefit of recovering learning and resetting models, educational models, as UNESCO has stated, the future of education and so on. So what's the information required? What's the information missing in order to transform and use the uses of evaluation, this evaluation, so that we can articulate improvements in the systems? So thank you, Santiago. Thank you, Felipe. And thanks to the World Bank and the Dialogue for inviting me. And I will answer your question, but there are some previous information. The first thing I wanted to say is I wanted to congratulate you for this report. It's wonderful, the work you've done. It's adequate in times of pandemic. And I wanted to remind the important role of the World Bank in the generation of standardized evaluations in Peru. They started in 1996, and there was a technical work that ended up in a solid outcome, and this is relevant at technical level. And this is relevant because there have been governments in this more than 25 years that have wanted to not use the evaluation, because sometimes the results are maybe dangerous or generate doubts and so on, but the solidity of QMC and the Ministry of Education have allowed this to persist. It's important, the dialogue. I wanted to remind all participants in this talk that the dialogue foster a group of task group on standardized evaluations with Regi, and the reports are available. Now, in order to respond to your question, Felipe, when I started working in this field, I thought there was not clarity with two fields, and I think Leticia, Sofia, Maria Isabel have covered this, but the first question is, what do we want to know? Because I thought that perhaps this was about evaluations following an automated model, and everyone is doing that. We are doing that. But the second thing is, how are we using this information? And I think that initially there were not clear answers to any of these questions, and This is something mentioned by our colleagues. Evaluating just because we want to evaluate, it's not the point. And here the reports show what we can do with this information, and I'm really pleased. There is a question from Mauricio Duque in the chat, which is really relevant. We need to differentiate the standardized evaluation that with the classroom evaluation, and these two things are completely different in this context. What do we want to do and what to do with that information? So to these two questions, I would add a third one, and which may be as relevant as the previous ones or even more. And it's what's the capacity of different stakeholders in the educational system to use this information in a pedagogical manner. My idea is that there is a lot to work on, and I think this has been mentioned by my colleagues. And why? Because the Latin American tradition is to evaluating in order to score, but evaluating it's not competencies or skills, but we are evaluating perhaps memory or mechanical procedures for due to different reasons that relate to a tradition which is vertical in the education, in which the professor, the teacher teaches and the student learns, and there is some feedback, and there is a lot of information written about this method, but we use the word dictation in order to refer to the pedagogical task. And I think that word actually embraces what we want or what we do in a traditional system. So in this evaluation system, the importance for teachers using different strategies and ways of evaluating in the classroom as part of the learning of students. It's the evaluation as part of a process of learning for students. And I think in there we have some limitations. And I think we need to work hard in the training and in our service, but I think this incorporates a question from Erika Tepler, the initial training of teachers. And I think the problem turns more complex because the teachers of teachers have not acquired or mastered these skills in order to interpret results of standardized evaluations or developing educational evaluations that can be used in the classroom. So the work we need to do here in terms of the pedagogical skills for teachers, which include the interpretation of standardized in the classroom with a pedagogical goal, it's important, or formative evaluation, that's the word. That's an important work in the Inter-American dialogue, and the World Bank perhaps should have to prepare a second report on this, teachers training, which I think it's key. Another angle to answer your question, Felipe, and that's something that has been mentioned in the report. It's we need to align instruments, because when you think about the standardized evaluation, we think of an evaluation that responds to the kind of questions you're asking. But if you are thinking about the curriculum in order to use one of the cases that were mentioned, you may need to conceive about a standardized evaluation that responds to the curriculum, but that it's also aligned to the instruments that will be used and with the programs as for training, teachers training at initial or during their service. But here we have the relevance, because these alignments, it's clearly related, at least in my mind, with the second question I was asking, which is how can we use this information? So if we have the information on the standardized evaluations, and from that point onwards, we can think of improvements in the curriculum or the teachers training or in the development of materials. So there we have a whole system that actually offers feedback. But if we do not conceive this way, what happens is what has happened by Pedro Ravela mentioned this. He's an expert, well known from Uruguay, in how the press in Latin America reports results of assessments. And what they do is they publish some headlines in which they say that in the analysis of this status, the word donkey was written several times. Donkey as a dumb. Meaning, and that's pejorative, that's insulting. And I laugh not to cry because the thing is that when results improve, press is not interested much. So there is another ally that we need to work harder with. Another angle to answer your question is what in literature we know as the Matteo effect. And I am concerned about this, and this is relevant here because the Matteo effect, if you remember the Bible, or Matthew, it's the one who has more receives more, and this has been applied in social sciences and economy in particularly, this Matthew effect. The ones with more money will make more money, but this has been applied to the education field because the one who learns the more will learn more. And we've found evidence of this in a longitudinal study that it's called Kids from the Young Lives, or Niños del Milenio. It's a follow from kids born from the year 2000, and the kids who showed better levels of vocabulary at 5 are the kids that were able to have better results in reading, mathematics, and this relates well, in times of pandemic, with the loss that may have happened, skills for these kids, and in cases in which they haven't had classes, this has been a dramatic case. We just opened schools after 2 years in which we had almost no lab activities and not much activity virtual level. And as Patricia Reed mentioned, all learnings need to be linked to academic content. Perhaps she's thinking about many things, and you too, and I agree. But since one of the questions asked about other ways that can be measured, I would like to suggest the importance of measuring digital skills. That's a skill that it's really important for the development, and I don't remember seeing this in the report, and I think we need to analyze this. Sorry, I took longer. I would like to stop here. I have more ideas, but let's keep talking, Felipe. I don't want to be the only one speaking here. No, thank you. Actually, there is a second round that we just start. The idea is to have more of a dialogue with my moderation, but there are many points that you offered and that are on the table for this discussion, and we really appreciate it. In fact, the question or the second round has to do with a conversation among the three of you. But it has to do with this element written in the chat. It's the more positive part, the most innovative part of all these processes and closing schools and radical changes in times of pandemic made us be creative and innovate. And as part of these innovations, we included this subject of the evaluation and how we can measure the impact we have that we may have in this unexpected closure of schools. So I wanted to ask the panel in general about this. a part about innovations and opportunities you've seen in the evaluation processes. What could state, what's the good part that we can incorporate from the results of this pandemic, and what can we incorporate in the future? What can be used? And the microphone is open for the panel to answer. The floor is yours for the three of you. Well, I will start by highlighting that there is a great opportunity in improving and generalizing and learning to use in a better fashion the beginnings of this formative evaluation that we started seeing more frequently in this time. And I think that's an opportunity so that teachers from the classroom may participate and may be the leaders of this evaluation process from the design of an evaluation, which is more formative, that actually generate inputs for them so that they can identify where students are and the heterogeneity that Felipe mentioned during the process. So effectively, this will allow teaching which is more adjusted to the needs and to the different groups of students. And I think as part of this process, this actually allows to understand the evaluation, not necessarily as a moment of the learning process, but as a tool that actually gives us information all along the process. So that's my answer. I would like to answer that the pandemic left empowered teachers in the use of new technologies that were able to transform their learning and teaching processes. Perhaps this was forced, but what we could reprise so is this process of a disruption in the teaching and learning process using new technologies and incorporate them in the new reality post-pandemic or in this time that we have in Nuevo León, and that relates to the pandemic. And I also consider, as Mariela mentioned, the importance of identifying students. In the case of the sixth grade of primary education, we can clearly identify who didn't answer, and that is a clue to determine who abandoned, who dropped out of school, and the reasons why this happened. Perhaps they moved to other entities or institutions, or perhaps because they took part in other kinds of activities, leaving education aside. So this, as the report from UNESCO mentioned, it's reimagining the future results of education and having this social contract with the educational community of each school with all the diversity they have, in which we eradicate this idea that the evaluation is just a label or some sort of punishment. But as Mariela said, this is a tool for improvement. It's a tool for improvement as long as teachers are empowered with them and not evaluated by them. So that would be my answer. Thank you for this question. So three clues here. In this scenario of pandemic, I've been working in Peru with two educational programs, a digital one in mathematics, which is called Conecta Ideas. The other one is in culture, with the World Reader, which is Crescele World Reader. It's an international application. And this has been really interesting. In order to start, many teachers didn't have in the initial training about education and technology and information about it. So it's important to incorporate this and make these programs as friendly as possible and demonstrate that this is not an additional load to them, but that they will offer additional information, that this will ease its implementation when they learn how to use them in time. And there is this subject of training teachers, which is important. The other thing, it's inequalities, because if you're in Lima, as I am now, and I have proper communication means, my internet signal, everything, it's strong. But even in big cities, for instance, in Iquitos, not to mention rural isolated areas, internet connectivity, it's quite limited. And I am sure that the same thing happens in Guatemala and Mexico. So I wanted to bring this to the table because this could be a new way of inequality. Because in the past, in 30, 40 years, we were scrubbing our heads and saying, well, it cannot happen that we have 30, 40, 50% of kids that do not go to school. So we've been able to advance a lot in coverage, but the new inequality ways have to do with the access to internet or the quality of teachers that you may have at school. So at the moment of talking about evaluations, I would also like to suggest or say that it's important to develop indicators on inequalities within the countries in order to have a healthy growth. A healthy growth would be a growth in which we elevate simultaneously the averages of the country, but we reduce gaps between the urban and rural, rich and poor, indigenous communities, and the rest, men and women, in which, just to mention a few. So I wanted to talk about inequality, and I wanted to close with something I consider important: the exaggerated emphasis on reading and mathematics. I can understand and I agree that in the first grades we make great efforts in order to develop skills in these essential areas, foundationals, the base of what can be learned later on. That's all right. But what I cannot understand is to keep focusing the evaluation only in these areas when you're in the last years of primary and secondary education, when we have some other problems in our countries that we would like to fight from our field education, for instance, violence against women, or the lack of solidarity, or corruption, crime, respect for institutions. It's a group of things that have to do with citizen skills. So if we talk about evaluations and we insist on reading, writing, mathematics in the first grades, I would like to suggest for the future have a greater diversity in different fields and evaluations and its use in order to strengthen democratic systems in the region via education. Thank you. Thank you. Two of the subjects that are important that we wanted to discuss with you and that you already covered, one has to do with involving teachers and the use of evaluations and this capacity of using technology for training teachers as elements in this process of preparing the report. And something that really caught my attention is that in the perceptions of teachers, critics to standardized evaluations at greater scale in our countries, when they talked about formative evaluations or diagnostic evaluations in the focus in the classroom or with a higher, better return, teachers were participating more actively. And this also gives us clues and leads us to the next question, which has to do with the temporality, the time of these processes that need to be conceived in terms of the short or very, very short term, weeks or months in which we will be returning 100% to the new normality. And there are some other challenges at midterm or even long term. And Santiago explained them with this thing of broadening these evaluation domains towards the end of each cycle. And this also incorporates in the short term or very short term, as Sofia Leticia mentioned in her comment, how we can identify this basic and fundamental learning. How can we work on that? Up to what point we recover, up to kids get into certain level, and then we go back to the curriculum. So this basic and fundamental learning and expected learning, this reopening process and the role of evaluation, how do you see this? I would mention our experience, Santiago, Mariela. Obviously, I agree with Santiago in terms that the evaluation should be broadened, but there are essential learnings that are a key for other learnings. And if we want autonomy in learning, we need to acknowledge that we lost in these past 2 years essential learnings that are key, that are fundamental. As we can see in Nuevo León, essential learnings that are the ones that we've handled here at reading, writing, basic calculation, scientific thought, but always linked to social and emotional education and skills of the 21st century. So how are we building these skills in the 21st century in our learning? And there's three components as part of the essential components. And Mejorado will apply an evaluation they shared with us. Maulian will participate on civic and ethical education. I don't know if this responds to what Santiago mentioned as civic values, but I think that's in order to rethink about this process of evolution of personal growth, sometimes with a social emotional cost, which was actually high. For some relative losses in these 2 years of confinement, at least in Mexico, of lockdown. In Mexico, we almost lost 2 school cycles. So in the long term, we should emphasize more these 21st century skills in order to assess how we are training teamwork and the resolution of problems and critical thought, which is a more complex process that requires attention. Well, I would like to add in terms of what Felipe mentioned about the expected learning and fundamental learnings or essential learnings. I think that effectively there is some tension which is permanent, and teachers live that on on a daily basis. But effectively, in this case, it requires accompaniment from the ministries of education, the secretary of education in the region, because this demand that at classroom level or educational institutions, they demand a prioritization, and sometimes teachers are in the classroom and they don't know what to prioritize. So how? So effectively, we need to have this accompaniment process with the teachers. And I think that in this whole process, there is a great opportunity to consolidate in this context in which there is an evaluation culture, but we also need to generate and promote this evaluation culture that demands educating different actors and sectors of the society. And as Santiago mentioned, communication or media needs to do a better use of the interpretation of results of these evaluations, what it means for directors to have an education report for teachers and families. So I think there are important implications in this process of having a different perspective, a different view of this evaluation. And in this process, something that I find relevant in the suggestion of Santiago, it's broadening the domains of evaluation. And in pandemic times, this was quite obvious, quite evident, and this was a discussion subject, which is how worn teachers were. And I think we need to start identifying elements in order to have early alerts in these processes of when professors are being worn out professionally and how we can help them to overcome this situation? That's a really good question and really good answers. I wanted to say something that may be polemic. I am nervous sometimes internationally, not with this report when we talk about the crisis of learning, because there have been learning crises, but if we analyze what matters the most in education, it's the development of people individually and collectively. And education is one of the tools, along other social policies and other interventions, in order to favor this development. So, after all, lived in times of pandemic with loss of relatives, friends, increase in poverty index, poverty rates. I must insist that I am nervous and I am confused when they talk about the crisis of learning, when in education we should be analyzing the human aspect in which learning is a part, but Sofia Leticia talked about measuring social emotional aspects in Nuevo León, and I think that's fine. But I think schools need to work harder on the human part, because if a kid, a student has learning problems, I think the human aspect after the recovery of schools and comfort they can get from school should be above trying to make them be at the level that person should be. So emphasizing in reading, mathematics, writing, I agree, but subordinated to the human aspect, to this integrating element of seeing education as an instrument for democratic well-being. In a different panel I was earlier, they were talking about happiness. I don't know if I would go that far, but I think the idea it's there. Thank you. Yes, and we are about to close this panel. So what Santiago said takes me to another question, because I would like to know your opinion about this. This has to do with the excuse that led us here, which is the presentation of this report with a series of recommendations. And I wanted to know your opinion about the recommendations. Do you see they are feasible, not feasible? Do you think that we may need to emphasize more one of them? And there is another question, which is simpler and more direct. If you had a magic wand, as Mordorovich said, if you had a magic wand and you had access to the ministers of education of your countries or regions, what would be the main recommendation you would offer? You are the main advisors of the Ministry of Secretary of Education. What would be your recommendation? What needs to be done? Well, I'll start to change the order. I think the strategies of diagnostic and formative evaluation, it's empowering teachers, involving them directly, and training which are relevant in order to guarantee the application and effective use of information. I think this is quite relevant. And that's what I've tried to suggest. And I would add, in order to think about the future, the initial training of teachers. But since we were talking about the Bible and not to seem too Catholic, but perhaps we could follow a precedent of the Bible which says that the last will be the first ones. What I mean is that one of the gaps or sources of crisis and injustice is that we forget that education is a fundamental right for everyone. And when we forget that when we conceive education as an instrument for economic development and so on, we've prioritized education in contexts in which with more money or with this amount of money we can reach more people in urban areas. But I would like to offer this recommendation of empowering teachers, but with a mentality of equality, justice in education. That's what I said if I had the magic wand. So the magic wand, it goes back to you. Well, in this same line, I deem necessary or relevant emphasizing in this recommendation mentioned because I think, and I think I already mentioned this link or this systemic logic of using inputs of the evaluation in order to have curricular improvements, it's still a debt in most of ministries of education in the region. And I think that here, this is not necessarily having the tools, but at level of teachers accompanying them so that they can make a proper use of these tools, taking into account that out of these tools, we have aids that are adjusted to those students who require them. And these are the students that are left behind in the corners of each classroom because they start being like gray kids that we do not see. And it's key in this process of it's important to see how evaluation becomes a possibility of getting information in order to support those students that actually require it. But that won't happen just by having the results. We need to drive this in the curriculum and accompany teachers so that they actually are able to do it. So now I take the magic wand and I would go back to the report because if I had the magic wand, perhaps with more limitations, but that's something we can do even without the magic wand, movement in the state in order to build a new social contract from schools. We received, and I guess that's a situation similar in at least other states in Mexico, we received schools destroyed. The abandonment for 2 years, the lack of interest. We didn't create a culture of the common good. Schools were vandalized, burned, abandoned. And in order to accomplish this empowerment of teachers in the educational process, this also includes the physical space as part of the community. And we need this new social contract that actually allows us to reconceive, as it was well expressed in the UNESCO report, the 5 axes that start with a different pedagogy that takes solidarity and cooperation adds an axis, but it's a pedagogy of hope at this in this moment in which we are living in fear in terms of pedagogy and emergency pedagogy. We need to build a pedagogy of hope, but in the classroom, with this magic wand, I would say that how in parallel we can offer or schools breaking the lack of access to internet, because internet is the means to recover what we lost and put that at service of a new educational model. So in this regard, we need to recover this concept of building communities of learning from schools that actually inform upwards and not upwards towards backwards. And in this context, I think we need to have a state plan of evaluation in Nuevo León that becomes a state system that actually allows us to compare ourselves, not having comparative criteria with other entities with different contexts, but among ourselves in order to be able to have an improvement of the learning. In the case of mid and higher education, or mid and secondary education, what we saw with the results is that there were not substantial changes before and after the pandemic. However, we kept the same mediocrity of those who failed. Not saying that I am labeling the youngsters, but labeling ourselves as responsible for this mid-level education that it's in this uh, stage and that has at least been at the margin, because we are not as competitive as we could be if compared to other private institutions. And I would emphasize that we need to break this trend that are some sort of power votes, because they point at different directions, and mid in primary and secondary education they differ. So if we put the core the life of our kids, we will be able to follow different paths of education paths, and up to the medium education, and aspire that this also covers higher education. But the central point would be the life of them in education as one of the elements to accomplish what Santiago mentioned, which is the search for happiness, which is this quest for happiness, that it's the aim of this educational process by offering well-being with inequality. And I think the magic one implies how we can increase the budget that should be that should offer equality, and that should reference the more vulnerable areas of our state. That's how I would use my magic wand, because I wanted to also answer Marta Pereira, because effectively, and Felipe won't say it, but I will be able to say it as a user of this training he gives us in the independent measurement of learning, which is the measurement that puts the core to social emotional education, not say, because it's done by the teachers in the first years for each kid with tenderness. It's just like playing with this model in order to identify basic things that actually helps us determine how much we need to strengthen the reading, understanding, writing, and basic calculus or calculation. And what we've done with this, it's organizing in primary education on Fridays, ludic workshops in which we group per knowledge areas, say this positively, and not per grade. So we may have kids from third, fourth, fifth grade, but if the problem is reading comprehension, so we have a ludic workshop, so that playing, we try to solve that gap, fill that gap, so that they don't feel they are labeled, as Marta expressed in the chat. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I wanted seize this opportunity. If I had the magic wand, I think I would ask or recommend the ministries to offer time. Disengage this hook of this obsession of executing plans the way they were designed in order to recover learnings with the time that it's required. Because there is a time, and we need to understand that we're coming from a disruptive process, which was unique. We had the bad luck of having to go through this, but this implies that when we return, we cannot expect that in 3, 4, 6 months or weeks, we will be at the level. We need to offer ourselves space to recover the love and the trust, self-care, motivation, learning strategies, so that teachers do not feel they are pressured to, well, perhaps we're too biblical, but so that teachers do not feel that they have to respond to two bosses. The idea is that they can take care of kids and focus on the kids and the benefit and the well-being and potentialization of kids, and that requires time. And it's the best time invested. If it takes 2 weeks more with a recovery course, then we can continue and follow the curriculum for the week 4 and 5. But perhaps we should get rid of this barrier that was imposed by ourselves, by our supervisors, and by the educational structure. And even though the secretary may say that it doesn't matter, when being accountable for the results. Here, ministries may offer an important change. With this, we close the session. Thank you very much for your comments. This was a fruitful panel, very interesting, and I appreciate your patience and your answers. And I would like to give the floor back to Ariel. Thank you, Felipe, Ariel, Mariela, Santiago, Felipe, for a great panel. It was wonderful. I won't try to summarize everything you said, but I take home some messages and tasks, homeworks. Santiago gave us the task of analyzing the teacher's training in terms of evaluation, and I think that's something we should work on. He also mentioned in the chat something I consider is a huge gap, which is disabilities, and it's a great flow, and we need to consider this from the context of what we believe we understand, such as this is a group of kids that may have suffered greatly during pandemic times, and I think the calling from Leticia for a new social contract, it's really important. And I think we have an opportunity, given the magnitude of the impact of what has happened, changes in the way in which the educational system works or has worked in these past 2 years, open doors that were not there before, that were closed before, so that we can think of new models, new roles, and that's the huge challenge that we have ahead. And I wanted to also announce or mention that next Wednesday at the same time as today, we will be presenting a second report, product of this cooperation, that is focused on remedial strategies. Not only how to diagnose, but what are the interventions and approaches we recommend in order to offer the best evidence. So you will be receiving this invitation, and we truly believe this is the next important step, and we will continue working on this. So Emanuela, the floor is yours. And with that, we close the session. Well, by my side, Ariel, I just wanted to greet quickly everyone. I think you offer a great conclusion. I wanted to thank you all. This has been a fruitful and rich discussion, and I think the systematization of experiences for diagnosis and standardized and formative are actually useful in the region. And here we're all facing the same problems. Many aspects were covered, and it would be really hard to summarize them all. Clearly, the main subject is the strategy and the use of this information. And I think it's about measuring and using this information, the role of teachers and how we can align this in key aspects. And Ariel has mentioned this, and how to use these results for remedial programs that we will see next Wednesday. So there is a lot to do, but we're all here. And what I wish is that we can keep sharing, working together on this. And the World Bank, we have all the willingness to keep supporting and cooperating on these subjects that are of utmost importance, that are so urgent. And in order to help kids to recover from these losses, and when doing this recovering, as Ariel mentioned and the panel mentioned, using seizing opportunities in order to be better than before, to see if we can learn from these lessons and actually improve in the long-term pedagogical process. I wanted to thank you all. And Ariel, perhaps the floor goes back to you in case you have anything else to add. No, that's it. I just wanted to thank Anna, Marina for your presentation, Felipe and the panel, and above all those who joined us in this session. So we expect to have you back with us on Wednesday.